They say revenge doesn't really solve anything. It's just a hollow victory, and in the end, you only end up feeling worse. But honestly, I'm not so sure I believe that. I got back at my wife, and I destroyed her career. Do I feel bad about it? Well, maybe a little less than I should. It gave me a sense of control, like I had finally taken something back from her that she'd taken from me without even realizing it. But before we dive into all that, let's rewind to the start. You need to understand how things got to this point. I'm just an ordinary guy at Baker. Not the most glamorous job, but it's what I've always loved. There's something about kneading dough, about the way it feels when it's just right. And the smell of fresh bread coming out of the oven, it's satisfying. But owning my own bakery, well, that's been a dream for years. I've never had the courage to pursue it, though. Too much at stake. Too many responsibilities. It's not just about making bread. There's the money, the staff, the rent, and the fear of failure. That thought alone kept me from taking the plunge. So I stayed where I was, working in someone else's bakery, doing my thing while the dream of owning my own place stayed on the back burner. My wife, though, was nothing like me. She was always after the next big thing. A director at some fancy corporation. One of those jobs where people wear expensive suits and sit in glass-walled offices all day. She managed teams, led projects. I didn't understand half of what she did, but it paid well. Very well. And I know what you're probably thinking. She made more money than me, and that should have bothered me, right? But it didn't. Not at first. We were different, but I loved her. Back then, I didn't care that she was climbing the corporate ladder while I was in the bakery, covered in flour, making bread for the neighborhood. Her job was demanding, but we still found time for each other. I never thought her success would be something that came between us. If anything, I was proud of her. She was a force to be reckoned with, and I admired that. But over time, things started to change. It happened slowly, like a trickle that eventually turns into a flood. She started staying late at work more and more. At first, I didn't think much of it. Her job was important, and I didn't want to be the guy complaining about her working hard. But then came the business trips. Always another meeting, another conference, another urgent matter that pulled her away. And when she was home, it felt like she wasn't really here. She was physically there, but emotionally, she seemed distant. Detached. I remember the first time I really noticed it. We were on the couch, watching some movie I don't even remember. But instead of curling up next to me like she used to, she was fixated on her phone, barely even looking at the screen. I tried to ask about her day, but she just gave me one-word answers like I was some afterthought. Something in my gut twisted, but I brushed it off. She was just tired, I told myself. Work stress. Nothing more. But it didn't stop. It got worse. I'd ask her about her day, and she'd snap at me, saying she was too tired to talk. Or she'd come home hours late, smelling like a perfume I didn't recognize, and she wouldn't offer any explanation. I wanted to confront her, but I didn't. Why? Because her job was important. She was the one bringing in the real money, the one covering the bills. How could I accuse her of anything when she was the one paying for most of our life? So I swallowed my suspicions and stayed quiet. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore that gut feeling forever. And by the time I finally admitted to myself that something wasn't right, I realized I didn't even recognize the woman I was married to anymore. Then, one night, really early morning, everything crashed down. It was around 3 a.m., and I was half asleep when her phone buzzed loudly on the nightstand, waking me up. Normally, I wouldn't have bothered with it, but something made me look. I reached over, glanced at the screen, and saw a text message. The screen lit up just enough for me to catch a glimpse. A heart emoji from a name I didn't recognize. The message preview was enough to make my blood run cold. Can't wait to see you again. I froze. My first thought was that I had to be dreaming. This couldn't be real. But there it was staring at me. My heart started pounding, so loud I thought I could hear it. I grabbed her phone, my hand shaking, but I had to know. I had to see the rest of that message. I tried to unlock it, but guess what? The password had been changed. Changed? I couldn't believe it. My stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't just some mistake. She was hiding something, and I just stumbled onto it. I sat there in the dark, her phone in my hands, my mind racing. I could hear her soft breathing beside me, totally unaware that her world was about to come crashing down. That was the moment everything clicked. The late nights, the business trips, the emotional distance, it all made sense now. And I knew, right then and there, that I wasn't going to let this slide. People say revenge doesn't solve anything, but I was about to find out just how satisfying it could be. The next morning, I couldn't shake what I'd seen. The heart emoji, the message. It was too real to just ignore. I didn't sleep much after that. When my wife finally woke up, I was ready. I waited until she was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing her hair, before I said anything. My heart was pounding, but I wasn't going to let it go. "Hey, I saw something weird on your phone last night," I said, trying to sound casual, like I wasn't already putting the pieces together. She looked at me in the mirror, her face unreadable. "What do you mean?" she asked, not stopping what she was doing. "It was a text at 3 a.m. from someone with a heart emoji," I said, watching her carefully. I was waiting for the guilt to show, for that little crack in her composure, but nothing. She blinked like I had just spoken in another language. "A heart emoji?" she repeated flatly. "Yeah, from one of your coworkers, I think. Can I see your phone?" I asked, holding my breath. She stared at me for a moment, like I'd completely lost my mind. Then, without saying a word, she unlocked her phone and handed it to me. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if she was going to snatch the phone away at the last second, but she didn't. So, I opened her messages and scrolled to the conversation I had seen earlier that night. But there was nothing. It was completely blank. I frowned and checked again, my thumb moving quicker this time. Where was it? I was sure of what I'd seen. I looked up at her, but she just raised an eyebrow, calm and collected. "Maybe someone sent it by accident and deleted it after," she shrugged, as if it was the simplest explanation. "You know how people do that, right? Send something to the wrong person, then poof, it's gone." She smiled, but it wasn't a real smile. It was the kind of smile you give when someone said something ridiculous, and you're just playing along. Happens to everyone. She made me feel like a complete fool, like I was being paranoid over nothing. I opened my mouth to argue, but then I just closed it. What was there to say? The message was gone, and there was no proof of what I'd seen. She took her phone back, slipping it into her bag, and gave me this look like I was wasting her time. "Anything else? Are we done here?" "I've got work," she said. I shook my head, feeling like I had just lost some invisible battle. "No, that's it," I muttered. "Good," she said, kissing me on the cheek like nothing had happened, then walked out the door. I stood there for a minute, trying to process everything. Maybe she was right. Maybe someone really did send a message by mistake and deleted it. Maybe I was just imagining things. But something didn't sit right with me. That feeling deep in my gut told me I was missing something. Like she was playing me somehow. But I buried it. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I was overreacting. Later that day, I figured I owed her an apology. After all, I had confronted her first thing in the morning with accusations, and she'd remained calm, even reasonable about it. Maybe I was just too suspicious. So, I sent her a text asking if she wanted to go out for dinner, somewhere nice. My way of saying sorry without having to actually say it. She responded quickly. "I can't. I've got too much work tonight. Maybe another time." I didn't think much of it. She was always working late. This wasn't new. I told her we'd plan something for the weekend instead. But by the evening, I was feeling down. That nagging feeling was still there, lingering in the back of my mind, and I just couldn't shake it. So, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I wandered around for a while, just trying to sort through my thoughts. My wife still hadn't come home yet. She said she was working late, and I believed her. Why wouldn't I? But then, as I walked past one of the nicer restaurants downtown, something caught my eye, and I froze. There she was sitting at a table, laughing and smiling. And right across from her was one of her colleagues, another director from her company, a guy I'd met maybe once or twice. They looked cozy, way too cozy for a work dinner. I stood there, frozen on the sidewalk, staring through the glass like an idiot. My heart started pounding again, that same thumping feeling from the night before. My brain was racing, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. She had said she was working late, right? Maybe this was part of it. A work meeting. I pulled out my phone and called her. It rang twice before she picked up. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, like I wasn't standing right outside the restaurant, staring at her. "Where are you?" "I'm still at work," she said casually, like she wasn't lying through her teeth. Just having dinner with some colleagues. Discussing a few work things. Why? I clenched my teeth. Just checking. You sure it's just work? Her voice hardened. Jesus. Why are you always so suspicious lately? I told you I'm just having dinner with colleagues. You really need to calm down. You're starting to sound paranoid. I felt my face flush with embarrassment. Was I overreacting? Maybe I was blowing it all out of proportion. Maybe I was just insecure, and it was showing. Sorry, I muttered, feeling small. I didn't mean to. No, you did. You're getting way too friendly with your suspicions. Look, I got work to do, okay? Stop calling me every 5 minutes like some needy teenager, she snapped, and then hung up. I stood there for a moment, staring at my phone, feeling like I'd just been slapped. I looked back through the window at her and her colleague. They were still talking, still laughing, and for a second I actually felt guilty. Guilty for thinking she might be cheating, guilty for suspecting her in the first place. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just imagining things. Work dinners happen all the time, right? I was the one being paranoid. I was the one making things worse. I shoved my phone back into my pocket and walked home with my head down. But I was so wrong. So wrong. A couple of weeks after that night, my wife told me about this corporate party her company was hosting. It wasn't a big deal. Just a little Friday night get-together with her colleagues. The kind of thing I usually avoided like the plague. I never liked corporate events, too many people pretending to enjoy themselves while talking about work. But after everything that had happened, I felt like I needed to go. I needed to put my suspicions to rest. I had been feeling guilty. Maybe I was the problem all along. Maybe I was just too paranoid. So I agreed to go. I figured showing up might smooth things over, maybe help me feel better about everything. Meanwhile, work had been going fine. There was this new girl who had joined the bakery. She was bright and cheerful, always smiling. I found myself chatting with her often. It wasn't anything inappropriate, just easy conversation. She didn't know I was married, and I never mentioned it. I don't wear my ring at work. It gets in the way, and it never came up in conversation. I guess part of me enjoyed being seen, just as me, not the married guy. But she's not really a part of the story yet. Let's get back to the party. It was a Friday night when we arrived separately. She'd left work early to help set things up while I finished my shift at the bakery and showed up a little later. By the time I arrived at the party, it was already buzzing with activity. People were chatting, drinks were being passed around, and music floated through the air. For the first hour, things seemed normal. We weren't exactly sticking to each other. She was off socializing with her colleagues, and I was by the bar trying to engage in shallow conversations with a few people I barely knew. It wasn't a blast, but it wasn't terrible either. I figured if I could make it through the night without causing any drama, I'd call it a success. Then, at some point, I spotted her across the room. She was standing with the same guy, her colleague, the one I'd seen her having dinner with a while back. The sight of them together made something inside me snap. I watched them closely. They were standing too close, talking in low voices like they were sharing a secret. That sinking feeling in my stomach returned, and I knew I had to get closer. I wasn't going to confront them in front of everyone, but I needed to hear what they were talking about. I had to know if my instincts were right, or if I was just imagining things. It wasn't hard to close the distance without them noticing. The crowd was thick, and people were moving around constantly. I simply blended in with the flow of the party, keeping my eyes locked on them, making sure they didn't catch on. When I was close enough, I stopped and listened. That's when it happened. The words I'd been dreading. "You need to leave him," her colleague said, his voice low but unmistakable. "It's time. You deserve better than this. Kick him out of the house. Make it official, and we can finally be together without hiding." My blood ran cold. I stood there, completely frozen. My mind was scrambling to process what I had just heard. My wife didn't say anything at first. She just nodded, like she had already made up her mind. And then, with a voice colder than I thought possible, she responded, "I know. It's just the timing. I need to make sure everything is in place before I make my move." Make her move? Like I was some inconvenience to be discarded when it suited her. My heart was pounding in my chest. That familiar thump. Thump, thump, but this time there was no doubt. No guilt. Only raw, white-hot anger. All my suspicions had been justified. They weren't just thoughts. I was hearing it straight from their mouths. They were planning this. Planning how to kick me out of the house, how to clear me out of the picture so they could be together with no shame, no consequences. And all this time, I had been the one made to feel crazy, the one made to feel like the fool while she was betraying me. But I didn't confront them right then. Not yet. I stood there frozen watching them, listening. If they thought they could work in the shadows, making their plans in secret, then I'd do the same. There was no point in causing a scene. No, if they thought they could quietly pull this off, I was going to show them just how wrong they were. So I backed away slowly, disappearing into the crowd and leaving the party early. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I just walked out the door, my mind already racing, plotting my next move. That night, all I could think about was what I had overheard. My wife, plotting to throw me out like I was nothing. The anger simmered in me, but I knew I had to be careful. I wasn't going to blow up. Not yet. I had to play this smart. I spent days running scenarios in my head. I knew what I had to do. If I was going to get back at her, I needed to hit her where it would hurt the most, her career. I wasn't going to let her and her slimy colleague just waltz off into the sunset while I was left in the wreckage. I needed to make sure she lost everything, just like she was planning to do to me. That's when the plan started taking shape. I knew about a competitor of her company, a business that had been working hard to steal market share from her firm. They never quite succeeded, but they were persistent. I figured if I could get them some inside information, some sensitive work data, it would be enough to shake things up for her company, maybe even cost her her job. But how was I going to do it? I couldn't get into her phone. She'd made sure of that with her new password. But her laptop? That was another story. She worked from home a lot, but on weekends, she barely even touched it. It was always sitting there in the living room, closed and collecting dust. I had seen her use it often enough to know what was on it. Emails, files, presentations, everything. Her laptop was the key to everything. I just had to get my hands on it without her noticing. I waited patiently for the right moment. Then one Saturday it finally came. We were having one of those typical lazy weekends. She was sprawled out on the couch, scrolling through her phone, and I casually mentioned that I had a business trip coming up. It wasn't a big deal. Just a simple, hey, I've got work to do, I'll be back tomorrow type of thing. She barely looked up. Okay, cool, she said, still engrossed in whatever was on her screen. No questions, no objections. Just indifference. And that made it easier. She didn't care where I was going or what I was doing. She was so wrapped up in her own world that she didn't even notice me packing my bag. What she didn't see was me slipping her laptop into my backpack, along with my clothes. She never used it on weekends anyway, so I knew she wouldn't miss it for a day. I left the house, and once I was in the car, I drove straight to a service center. I wasn't a tech expert, so I needed help with the next part. I told the guy at the center that I needed everything backed up from her laptop. Work files, emails, anything of value. He didn't ask any questions. Didn't even blink. I was paying for the service, and as far as he was concerned, the laptop was mine. An hour later, I had a complete copy of everything. Her emails, her work documents, her confidential files. The kind of stuff that if it fell into the wrong hands could bring her company to its knees. Exactly what I needed. I didn't bother going through it all. I didn't care about her personal life. That wasn't my focus. All I wanted was to destroy her career. Once I had everything I needed, I drove back home, calm on the outside but buzzing with excitement inside. I returned the laptop to its exact spot, untouched, as though nothing had happened. She was still lounging around, completely unaware that her entire professional life was now in my hands. I kissed her on the forehead like it was just another day and went about my evening, pretending everything was normal. But inside, I was electric with power. She had no idea, but I was already 2 steps ahead of her. While she was busy scheming with her colleague, planning her exit, I was working on my own strategy. The question now was how I was going to play my cards. After overhearing that conversation at the party, I couldn't stop thinking about my next move. Taking her down, destroying her career, was the goal. But I had to be careful. No one could trace this back to me. It had to hurt her in a way that would echo through her entire life. It took time, but eventually, I found the perfect target. A guy from one of her company's biggest competitors. He wasn't an executive, but he was well-connected, and that was enough to get the wheels turning. It was clear his company was desperate for an advantage, something that could give them an edge over hers. And I had just what they needed, inside information straight from her laptop. I reached out to him, carefully, not wanting to tip my hand too early. When we finally met, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I offered him confidential files, the kind of files that could seriously shake things up at her company. But I wasn't giving it away for free. I named my price, and it was a hefty one, enough to set me up for a long time. At first, he hesitated, said it was too risky, that he couldn't just hand over that kind of money without being sure the data was real. I expected that reaction, so I agreed to let him take a look at it first. But there was no way I was going to risk revealing myself. I needed this to be clean and anonymous, so I kept it simple. I wore a protective mask, not flashy, but enough to make sure I wouldn't be recognized. We agreed to meet in a secluded parking lot in the middle of nowhere. It felt like something out of a crime movie, the kind of place where bad deals go down. I showed up with a portable hard drive tucked under my jacket, and he was already there, leaning against his car, looking anxious. I handed him the drive, and he plugged it into his laptop without a word. I stood back, heart pounding in my chest. Each second felt like an eternity as I watched him, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. He didn't speak, just kept scrolling, clicking through emails, confidential reports, financial data, everything that could sink her and her company. It must have been at least half an hour before he finally looked up at me, and I saw the greed in his eyes. "This is good," he said, nodding. "It's worth the money." I nodded, but I wasn't done yet. There was one more thing. I needed to make sure this went the way I wanted it to. "When this blows up," I said, keeping my voice even, "I want the story to be that my wife leaked the data. She's the one who gave it to you." He paused for a moment, probably weighing the risks, but then he shrugged. "Fine. No skin off my back," he said. "Make it personal." I handed him a matchbook with her name written on it, just to drive the point home. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. When the scandal hit, she was going to take the fall for it, and no one would ever suspect me. We exchanged the cash, and I felt the weight of it in my hand, knowing that this was just the beginning. As I walked away from that parking lot, the adrenaline was still coursing through me. It wasn't just about the money. It was about knowing that her whole world was about to unravel, just like she had planned to do to mine. When I got home, I hid the money in a spot she'd never think to look. She was too absorbed in her phone to even notice that I'd been gone. Another piece of the plan, another step forward. But I had no idea just how far things were about to spiral for her. The next morning, everything seemed normal on the surface. I went to work as if nothing had happened. But inside, I was a different person. I was in control. For the first time in a long time, I actually felt good. I ended up spending a lot of time talking to a new girl at work. She was bright, full of energy, the kind of person who made everything feel lighter. We laughed about little things, and it felt easy, natural, like I didn't have to carry the weight of the world on my shoulders for once. At the end of the day, she asked if I wanted to grab a coffee. I hesitated for just a second, but then I thought, why not? I needed a distraction. Someone to take my mind off the storm that was brewing at home. So I said yes. We ended up at a small, cozy cafe not far from work. It was the kind of place where you could just unwind. We drank coffee, talked, laughed, and for the first time in ages, I felt like I was just me again. No drama, no betrayal. Just two people enjoying each other's company. As we finished up, she asked if I'd walk her home. I agreed. And as we walked through the cool evening streets, the conversation turned quieter, more personal. When we got to her place, she stopped and turned to me. "Do you want to come in?" she asked, her eyes asking a question I knew all too well. I hesitated. This was a line I hadn't crossed before, not even after everything my wife had done. But there was something about the moment, something inevitable, like it had been leading up to this all along. I couldn't avoid it anymore. So instead of walking in, I stopped and told her the truth. "I need to tell you something first," I said, my voice low. "I'm married." She blinked, clearly surprised, but didn't say anything. I told her everything, the affair, the betrayal, the revenge I had set in motion. I didn't leave anything out. I half expected her to send me away, to tell me to leave, but instead, she just nodded, processing it all. After a long pause, she got up and went to the kitchen. When she returned, she had a bottle of whiskey in her hand. "Whiskey?" I asked, surprised. "I thought you liked wine." She gave me a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes after hearing the whole story. Wine wasn't going to cut it. We sat there, quietly sipping our drinks, the tension between us growing. At some point, the space between us just seemed to evaporate. I don't even remember the exact moment, but before I knew it, we were in bed together. It wasn't planned, it wasn't calculated, but it felt like it was always meant to happen. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. And honestly, I didn't feel a shred of guilt about it. My wife didn't call. She didn't even text. She was too absorbed in the disaster unfolding at her job. Her career was falling apart, and it was just beginning to hit the fan. She didn't have the time or the energy to wonder where I was. That suited me just fine. When I finally went back home after staying at my colleague's place, I knew it was time to confront what had been simmering for months. The unraveling had been slow, but now it felt like it was coming apart completely. I walked through the door, half expecting her to be packing her things, or maybe trying to act like everything was fine. But no, she was waiting for me. The moment I stepped inside, she exploded. "You've ruined everything," she screamed, her face contorted in fury. "Do you even have the slightest idea of what you've done? My career is over. I'm a joke at work, and it's all because of you." I stood there, absorbing her words. There was no point in arguing, no use in defending myself. She was spiraling, and I wasn't going to waste my breath trying to save a sinking ship that wasn't mine anymore. Her voice grew louder with each accusation. "You've always been nothing, just some Nevadan who's never amounted to anything. And now, you've dragged me down with you. You've destroyed everything I worked for." I wasn't the type to boast about my achievements or my place in the world, but hearing her tear me down like that, it hit harder than I expected. Maybe because, even though I knew it was over, a small part of me still cared. I clenched my fists, but I kept my cool. There was no point in letting her anger drag me into another fight. I took a deep breath, and with a calmness I didn't feel, I said the words I'd been holding back for so long. "I think it's time we get a divorce." For a moment, she froze. I could see the shock in her eyes, like she hadn't expected me to say it out loud. Then, a laugh, but not a real one. A cold, bitter laugh that chilled me to the bone. "A divorce? Oh, that's rich. You think you can just walk away from all this after everything you've done?" she sneered. I nodded. "Yeah, Ido. Because I'm done. Done with you. Done with all of it." The silence in the room was deafening. She stood there, staring at me with hate in her eyes, her chest rising and falling with each breath. I could see the wheels turning in her head, trying to come up with a response, but there was nothing left to say. We both knew it was over. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her, but I didn't follow. I didn't need to. It was already decided. The divorce process moved faster than I anticipated. There wasn't much to fight over. She was too preoccupied with her career's collapse to care about anything else. And I was too drained to argue about anything but making my escape. But as the dust settled on the ruins of my marriage, something unexpected started to grow. I kept seeing my colleague, the one who had been there for me through everything. We didn't rush into anything, but there was a connection. It was easy, comfortable, a refreshing change from the constant tension of my old life. I finally did something I'd never had the guts to do before. I bought the bakery I'd been working at. It was mine now. No more punching the clock for someone else, no more worrying about failing. It was a huge step, and it felt incredible. For the first time in a long time, I was building something for myself. Life started to shift in ways I hadn't anticipated. My new relationship was going great. We laughed. We enjoyed each other's company. It felt effortless, like I could finally breathe again. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel weighed down by the past. The words my wife had thrown at me, about being some worthless Nevadan who never achieved anything, still echoed in my mind, but now they felt hollow. I had built something, I had made something of myself, and it was more than she could ever understand. As for her, I didn't keep tabs on her downfall. I heard rumors. Her situation at work was getting worse, but I didn't care enough to dig into the details. She was facing the consequences of her own decisions, and I had my own life to focus on. A year has passed since everything fell apart, and to be honest, I never thought I'd be here in this place. After everything, I never imagined I want to take that step again. But life is a way of surprising you. I married the colleague who had been there for me through it all. She's been my anchor, my support, and I couldn't ask for a better partner. And here's the kicker. She's pregnant. We found out a few months ago, and now we're getting ready to welcome a baby into our lives. It still feels surreal, but every day it gets more real. I'm excited, nervous, and more than anything, grateful. The bakery's doing better than I ever thought possible. After buying it, I poured everything I had into making it work, and it paid off. The business is thriving, and I've even had to hire extra help to keep up with demand. It's still hard work, but it's the kind of work that feels meaningful. Looking back, I can hardly believe how much has changed in just a year. A year ago, I was at rock bottom. Now I've built something real for myself. My ex is out of my life, and I've moved on completely. I've let go of the anger and the resentment. I just want to thank everyone who followed along with my story, who offered advice, support, or kind words. You don't know how much it helped me through the tough moments. Reading your comments, knowing people cared, it made all the difference. Thank you. Here's to new beginnings, better days, and the future ahead.